Now, we continued during the Kennedy administration to have tensions in Cuba. U.S. actions in the Bay of Pigs and the Berlin crisis encouraged hardliners in the Soviet Union. The Soviets were worried about another invasion of Cuba and U.S. nuclear missiles that were placed in Turkey. Kennedy was worried about accusations of being soft on communism. And then we have an incident where a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba detected Soviet surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs, in Cuba. And the Soviets argued that the SAMs were defensive missiles and swore that they didn't have any offensive missiles in Cuba, but later U-2 flights proved that the Soviets had lied. This leads us to a great threat because the Soviets now could reach large portions of the eastern seaboard very easily. They could damage a lot of the United States with nuclear weapons based in Cuba. So this becomes known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Kennedy assembles a group of advisors that become known as XCOM, and to help him plan a response. XCOM military members favored an airstrike, perhaps followed by a land invasion of Cuba. Others argued for a naval blockade. Kennedy agreed with this plan. So they established what becomes known as a quarantine. Technically, a blockade is considered an act of war and is illegal. So rather than calling it a blockade, they call it a quarantine. And the world watched as Soviet ships that were carrying missile parts approached the naval blockade. Eventually, they turned back, and a crisis was averted. But there's still continuing tension. The whole thing really plays out over about 13 days. Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the missiles if the United States pledged never to invade Cuba. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev took steps to ease tensions between their countries and actually through kind of a secret backline channels communicated with each other. And they agreed to set up a hotline to allow direct communication between the two leaders. And part of this agreement that ended the tensions was we promised we would remove our weapons from Cuba at a later date. The Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed, ending atmospheric and underwater testing of nuclear weapons as well. And all of this comes about as the end, or as a part of the end of this Cuban Missile Crisis. But this is actually probably the point in the Cold War where we actually came the closest to all-out nuclear war with the Soviets.